You're living through the worst collapse in American history. And the most frightening part is that most people do not even realize it is happening. Because when someone working full-time still has to sleep in their car, when a 70-year-old has to return to work just to afford their medication, and when more and more families are no longer sure how much longer they can maintain their current way of life, these are no longer isolated stories. This collapse is not arriving with a loud bang. It shows up in grocery bills that get higher every week, in grown children who cannot afford to buy a home, in familiar pharmacies disappearing from town, in the feeling that more and more people are working harder but living worse. Each sign on its own may not seem especially alarming, but when you put them all together, they begin to tell a very different story about America today. A retired man walks into a grocery store with $100 in his wallet. He is not buying steak. He is not buying wine. He is not buying anything luxurious. Just the same things he has been buying for years: a little meat, a carton of milk, a loaf of bread, and a few items for dinner. When the register stops, the total comes to more than $80. He stares at the screen for a few seconds, then quietly pulls out his wallet and pays. The most frightening part is not the number itself. The most frightening part is that he is no longer surprised by it. He has gotten used to it. And that is exactly how a crisis unfolds quietly. Not when people panic, but when they begin accepting things that were once considered abnormal. According to the Federal Reserve's financial survey, nearly 40% of Americans cannot cover a $400 emergency expense without borrowing money or selling something. Think about that. A new set of tires, an air conditioner repair in the middle of summer, an unexpected trip to the emergency room. Just one small setback can push millions of families into debt. Meanwhile, more than 21 million Americans are spending over half of their income just to keep a roof over their heads. Not for a mansion, not for a luxurious lifestyle, just to hold on to a place to live. After the rent or mortgage is paid, whatever remains has to cover groceries, utilities, insurance, medication, and every other expense of daily life. That is what leaves so many people confused. From the outside, their lives look almost unchanged. They still live in the same house. They still drive the same car. They still work the same job. They still wake up at the same time every morning. But somehow, their money disappears faster with each passing month. On paper, incomes have gone up, but electricity bills have risen faster. Auto insurance premiums have risen faster. Home insurance costs have risen faster. Grocery prices have risen faster. Healthcare expenses have risen faster as well. And what is especially notable is that most of those increases involve things people cannot simply give up. This generation was taught that if you worked hard, saved money, and lived responsibly, life would gradually become more stable over time. But for many families today, the opposite is happening. They are still working, still putting in overtime, still trying to save. Yet the goal called financial stability keeps moving farther away with each passing year. You're not buying more than you used to. You're simply paying more to maintain the life you once had. There is a term that barely existed in conversations about America just a few decades ago: working homeless. People who are homeless despite having a job. The fact that this phrase is appearing more and more often is, by itself, a sign that something is changing. For generations, the belief was that a full-time job might not make you wealthy, but it should at least be enough to provide a roof over your head, a bed to sleep in, and a place to return to after a day of work. Today, that is no longer guaranteed. According to recent housing data, hundreds of thousands of Americans are living in cars, RVs, or other forms of temporary shelter. What is especially notable is that many of them are still employed. They are not sitting at home. They have not left the workforce. They wake up every morning just like everyone else. They go to work on time. They pay their taxes. They follow the law. They do everything society asks of them, yet they still cannot afford a normal apartment. That may be one of the most troubling paradoxes in modern America. A car was once simply a way to get to work. Now, for some people, it is also a bedroom, a living room, and the place where they store everything they still own. During the day, those vehicles look no different from thousands of others in a parking lot. But when night falls, they become homes for people who will still be reporting to work the next morning. The problem is not that they are not earning money. The problem is that housing costs have been rising faster than wages for many years in a row. In many cities, rent has climbed so high that an average worker must spend most of their income just to keep a roof over their head. And when the gap between income and the cost of living becomes too large, things that once seemed impossible begin to appear. A person can work 40, 50, even 60 hours a week and still be unable to afford a place to live. This is no longer just the story of a few expensive coastal cities. It is a sign that the bridge between work and stability is beginning to crack. For generations, Americans were taught that if they worked hard, lived responsibly, and remained self-reliant, life would gradually get better over time. But for a growing number of people, that formula is no longer working the way it once did. In the past, having a job almost always meant having a home. Today, that is no longer certain. When a full-time job can no longer buy a place to sleep, the system has changed. For generations, owning a home was considered one of the most important milestones of adulthood in America. It was not just an asset. It was a sense of stability. It was where a family put down roots. It was something parents hoped to pass on to their children. Today, that dream is becoming more distant for millions of people. Home prices in many areas have risen sharply in recent years. At the same time, mortgage rates have climbed to some of the highest levels in years, causing monthly payments to soar even for buyers looking at the most ordinary homes. For many first-time buyers, the barrier is no longer saving enough for a down payment. It is the inability to keep up with the pace of the market. According to numerous recent studies, the percentage of young adults living with their parents remains significantly higher than it was for many previous generations. And that is creating a picture that is becoming increasingly familiar in American households. Bedrooms that were once expected to be used only temporarily after college graduation. Basements that were originally considered extra living space. Children in their late 20s and even their 30s still living under the same roof as their parents. Not because they are lazy, not because they lack ambition, and in many cases, not because they made poor financial decisions, but because housing costs have risen faster than incomes have been able to keep up. The sad reality is that this is not just a story about real estate. It is a story about a milestone of adulthood that is gradually disappearing. In the past, many young people saved money with the hope of one day buying their first home. Today, many are simply hoping that next month's rent will not go up again. And when homeownership becomes out of reach for a growing number of people, America is not just losing new home buyers. It is losing a piece of the American dream that existed for generations. In the past, young people saved money to buy a home. Today, many quietly hope that next month's rent will not increase again. If you want to see part of the change taking place in America, sometimes you do not need to read a single economic report. You simply need to drive through a small town. A place that once had a familiar pharmacy on the corner. A place that once had a discount store where people could buy everyday essentials. A place people stopped by on their way home from work. A place where familiar faces crossed paths every week without ever needing to make plans. In communities across America, those places are disappearing one by one. Rite Aid has closed hundreds of stores following its bankruptcy. CVS previously announced plans to close approximately 900 locations. Dollar Tree and Family Dollar also announced the closure of roughly 1,000 stores nationwide. From a distance, those may seem like nothing more than numbers in a business report. But for many small towns, the impact is much greater. A store closure is never just a store closure. It may be the nearest pharmacy for dozens of miles. It is where seniors pick up their heart medication, diabetes medication, or blood pressure prescriptions every month. It is where families on tight budgets buy basic necessities at the lowest prices they can find. It is where neighbors unexpectedly run into one another, exchange a few words, and are reminded that their community is still there. The sad reality is that many people only realize the value of these places after they are gone. For decades, these stores were simply there. They survived recessions. They survived financial crises. They survived other difficult periods. Their presence became so familiar that many people assumed they would always be there. Today, more and more signs are going dark. More and more parking lots are sitting empty. More and more storefronts are displaying faded for lease signs weathered by years of sun and rain. In large cities, people often have other options, but in many small towns, when a pharmacy closes, there is no second pharmacy across the street. When a discount store disappears, there are not many alternatives for families already counting every dollar in their monthly budget. And that is when the story is no longer about retail. It becomes a story about community. Because sometimes what keeps a town alive is not a multi-million-dollar development project. It is the places where people still see one another every day without realizing how important those places truly are. When the last store disappears, the community begins to disappear with it. Look at your grocery cart today and compare it to what it looked like just a few years ago. The shelves are still full. Beef is still there. Eggs are still there. Coffee is still there. Canned foods still line entire aisles throughout the supermarket. But something is changing. More and more people are walking into stores with the calculator app already open on their phones. They no longer begin a shopping trip with the question, "What does my family want to eat this week?" Instead, they begin with a different question. What can I still afford to buy this week? According to the USDA, tens of millions of Americans continue to face food insecurity at varying levels. Meanwhile, the prices of many essential items have risen sharply in recent years, forcing families to plan each grocery trip more carefully. What is notable is that food has not disappeared from store shelves. Supermarkets are still full of products, but more and more people can no longer afford to buy the things they used to buy. A package of ground beef becomes a decision that requires careful thought. A carton of eggs is no longer something casually tossed into the shopping cart. A familiar can of coffee now causes many people to stare at the price tag longer than they once did. This is not just a story about food prices. It is a story about choices that are gradually becoming more limited. For many years, family dinners were usually decided by preference. What should we have tonight? What should we cook this weekend? Should we make something special for the family? But for a growing number of families, the budget is beginning to answer those questions. Some meals appear less often on the dinner table. Some familiar foods are replaced with cheaper alternatives. Some families simply buy less so the final bill does not exceed their limit. The sad reality is that these changes usually happen very slowly, not enough to shock people in a single day, but enough to reshape a family's habits over the course of a few years. And that may be the most thought-provoking part of all. The supermarkets are still full of food, but that no longer means people can buy whatever they want the way they once could. Food is not disappearing from supermarket shelves, What is gradually disappearing is people's ability to afford bringing it home. American credit card debt has surpassed $1 trillion, the highest level ever recorded in history. That is an enormous number. But the more important question is not the size of the debt. It is why that debt exists in the first place. For many years, credit cards were often associated with vacations, expensive purchases, or spending beyond one's means. Today, the story is changing. More and more families are not swiping their cards to pay for a vacation. They are swiping them to fill up their gas tanks. They are swiping them to pay their electric bills. They are swiping them to cover their heating costs during the winter. They are swiping them to buy groceries and the most basic necessities of daily life. In other words, they are using debt to replace the portion of their income that is no longer enough to keep up with the cost of living. And that is when the problem becomes dangerous. Because a grocery bill paid with a credit card today does not actually disappear. It is simply pushed into next month. When next month arrives, a new bill appears before the old one has been paid off. Then interest begins to accumulate. Then the balance starts growing. Then the minimum payment becomes a permanent part of the monthly budget. Meanwhile, the average interest rate on many credit cards has now climbed above 20%, and for many cardholders, the actual rate is even higher. What begins as a temporary solution can quickly turn into a cycle that is extremely difficult to escape. At the same time, buy now, pay later services have exploded across America. In the past, people typically financed things like a car or a home. Today, many people are splitting payments for clothing, household goods, and even relatively inexpensive purchases. That is a notable shift. Not because people want to spend more, but because a growing number of people can no longer afford to pay the full cost up front. The most concerning part is that these debts rarely appear all at once. They accumulate slowly. One bill at a time, one tank of gas at a time, one grocery trip at a time, until many families realize they are using tomorrow's money to pay for today's necessities. For a long time, credit was viewed as a tool that helped people move ahead. Today, for many families, it is becoming a tool that helps them avoid falling behind. Credit cards were once a convenient tool for everyday life. Now, they have become a lifeline covered in thorns. A lifeline designed to help people stay afloat, yet more and more people are clinging to it simply to avoid sinking. Look at the people standing at checkout counters in Walmart, helping customers at Home Depot, or working behind the counter at fast food restaurants across America. More and more gray hair is showing up in those places. It is no longer unusual. For many years, retirement was seen as the reward after decades of hard work. A person worked diligently, saved consistently, and contributed to the system with the hope that one day they could spend more time with family, enjoy their grandchildren, or simply slow down after a lifetime of staying busy. But for many people, that plan is changing. According to federal labor data, millions of Americans age 65 and older are still part of the workforce, and that percentage is significantly higher than it was several decades ago. For some, it is because they genuinely want to keep working. But for many others, the reason is much simpler. They need additional income. Food costs have risen. Insurance premiums have risen. Healthcare costs have risen. And the savings they once expected would carry them through retirement no longer provide the same sense of security. What is especially thought-provoking is that many of them did everything their generation was told to do. They worked for 30 years, 40 years, even longer. They saved. They avoided debt. They prepared for retirement. They believed that if they worked hard enough, they would eventually earn the opportunity to rest. Today, however, more and more people still have to wake up every morning and return to work to make up for the gap between the cost of living and their fixed income. That may mean a few shifts each week. It may mean a part-time job, or simply a way to afford medication, pay utility bills, and keep life stable for a little while longer. The sad part is not working at an older age. Many people still enjoy their work. The sad part is that a growing number of people do not truly have a choice. For generations, retirement was viewed as the destination at the end of a lifetime of work. Today, for many people, that destination no longer feels as certain as it once did. That is why more and more people are entering their 70s with an employee badge still hanging from their chest instead of enjoying the retirement years they once imagined when they were young. And perhaps that is one of the most thought-provoking changes in modern America. A generation that did everything it was asked to do. Worked, saved, contributed. Yet is still discovering that retirement is no longer guaranteed. A generation that spent its entire life working is realizing that a peaceful retirement is no longer the default destination. It is becoming something increasingly expensive to maintain. You do not need to be an economist. You do not need to read reports from the Federal Reserve. And you do not need to follow the stock market every day to know that something is changing. The signs are right in front of you. Every single day. In things that seem completely ordinary. A locked glass cabinet at Walgreens protecting nothing more than a bottle of shampoo or a tube of toothpaste. More and more self-checkout stations appearing while fewer and fewer employees stand behind the register. Restaurants that once had waiting lines on weekend evenings now have parking lots that look noticeably emptier. Storefronts that stayed lit for years now display faded for lease signs weathered by sun and rain. Each sign on its own may not seem especially important. One store closing. One restaurant with fewer customers. One shopping center with less foot traffic. But when all of those things begin appearing everywhere at the same time, they start telling a different story. A story that many people have already felt but struggle to put into words. It is the feeling that everyday life no longer works the way it used to. Not because of one single event. Not because of one sudden moment of collapse. But because small changes have been accumulating day after day. Slowly enough that many people do not notice, yet significant enough that when they finally look back, an entire town feels different. That is why more and more people share the same feeling when they drive through the place they call home. Nothing changed dramatically in a single day. But somehow, nothing feels quite the same anymore. And perhaps that is the most thought-provoking part of all. Because major crises rarely begin with a loud explosion. They begin with small cracks that everyone can see, but no one believes are important. You do not need any economic report to understand what is happening. You only need to take a drive around the town where you live. By this point, perhaps the most thought-provoking thing is not the price of eggs, not home prices, not credit cards, not insurance premiums. It is what happens when all of those things show up in the life of the same family at the same time. If rent alone went up, many people could still adapt. If food alone became more expensive, they could still cut back somewhere else. If healthcare costs alone increased, they could still find a way to manage. But what is happening today is not a single crisis. It is multiple smaller crises arriving at the same time. A higher utility bill, a more expensive trip to the grocery store, an increase in insurance costs, a new prescription, a credit card balance that has not been paid off. None of those things, by themselves, are enough to break a family. But when they all arrive together, they begin to do something else. They erode the feeling of security. That is why so many people today are no longer worried about a single bill. They are worried about the next bill, and the one after that. They no longer ask, "Do I have enough money?" they begin asking, what if one more thing goes wrong? What if the car breaks down? What if someone has to go to the hospital? What if the landlord raises the rent again? What if I lose my job? That is the kind of pressure that does not appear in any economic report, but it shows up every night when people sit at the kitchen table and stare at the numbers in their bank accounts. And perhaps that is the biggest common thread connecting all the stories we have talked about today. The person who has a job but still cannot make ends meet. The young adult who cannot afford a home. The towns losing familiar stores. The families shrinking their grocery budgets. The older Americans returning to work. At first glance, they seem like different stories, but in reality, they all lead to the same feeling. The feeling that one more hit could be enough to snap a life that is already stretched to its limit. That is why everything feels harder than it used to. Not because of one single storm, but because more and more families are living at the center of several storms at the same time. This is not a single crisis. It is multiple pressures converging at once and testing the resilience of millions of American families. What may be most worth thinking about is not home prices, food prices, or the numbers in economic reports. It is the fact that tomorrow morning, millions of Americans will still wake up on time, go to work, pay their bills, and do their best to keep life feeling normal. But year after year, the cost of maintaining that sense of normalcy keeps getting more expensive. Perhaps the most concerning part is not that things are changing. It is that more and more people are beginning to accept those hardships as a normal part of everyday life. So what about you? Of all the changes happening around you right now, which one is having the biggest impact on you or your family? Share your thoughts in the comments below.